Is it okay to beat a slave? I've been asked this in personal conversation. I've been asked this in a debate. If we take this passage in Exodus 21, verses 20 through 21, it seems pretty jarring and straightforward that it might be okay. Let's read the passage, and then you are an Old Testament scholar writing a commentary on Exodus. I want to know what you think about this. So 21 verse 20 says, when a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. Now, on the surface, this seems messed up. On one level, it's like you kill a slave, okay, there's consequences. But if you beat the slave close enough to death and it survives, then you're not to be avenged. And then it calls the slave his money as if the slave is just property. Now, I know you have a take on this, but is there any wider context that would help us before we dive in?
Yeah. The wider context is we're in the covenant code of Exodus, which runs from end of chapter 20 through chapter 24, or through up to chapter 24. And the covenant code is dominated by case law or casuistic law, which is explaining what happens in non-ideal situations. We're right in the section that's titled in my Bible, Personal Injuries, and it really is about liability. When someone gets hurt, who has to pay for it? Who pays the medical bills? Who pays for the loss of labor? So I think it's really important to know that in casuistic law, there's a structure in which they say, if this happens, then this. If this happens. So that if, or in the ESV, when, is saying, here's the unideal situation, and now how shall you handle it? And there's a hierarchy. There's two different ways of saying if in Hebrew, and they tend to it like makes up a nested outline where like, here's the broad category, and now here's a subcategory of this broader category.
All right.
And I think what's really helpful to notice is that the verses right before this are about injury. If people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fist, and the victim doesn't die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable if the other can get up and walk around outside with a staff. In other words, no death penalty, because they didn't die. However, the guilty party must pay the injured person for any loss of time and see that the victim is completely healed. So our overarching situation here is that the one who causes the injury covers the loss of labor. And that is the scenario in which now verse 20 is a subset of that.
The second if, so to speak.
The second if. Well, what if the person that's injured is the slave, or the indentured servant would be a better translation, of the one who injured them? So this is not saying go ahead and beat people. This is saying, again, hypothetical scenario, what if there's this unevenness, a lack of symmetry between the two parties? One's in charge, the other one's the indentured servant. And it says anyone who beats their male or female slave or indentured servant with a rod must be avenged or punished if the slave dies as a direct result. So this is saying that the death penalty still pertains even if the person who dies was an indentured servant. Even if they were socially unequal, that person's life still holds value. So that's the first thing to notice.
Okay, so that's the first verse.
Yep.
So the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged,
which suggests that the death penalty comes into play.
Okay, so this fits the principle of an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth justice.
For life.
And before we get to the slave is his money, the larger context before it is the slave has equal value as the slave or servant owner would have, because it's made in the image of God. That framing is vital. Okay, really helpful. Keep going.
But they are not to be avenged if the slave recovers after a day or two. So the idea is no death penalty if the person recovers. But then there's still this outstanding question of, well, normally if there's an injury and it takes them a few days to recover or a while to recover, then the person who did the injury is responsible to pay for loss of labor. Well, how does that work if the person that they would pay it to their labor belongs to someone else and it's you, right?
Oh.
So like
Okay.
who gets paid in this case for the
Interesting.
loss of work? And I think this last phrase, which is very improperly translated both in the ESV and in the NIV. NIV says, since the slave is their property. No, in Hebrew it's since it is his silver. That's all it says in Hebrew. It is his silver. You could translate that he is his silver. So that's where the ESV gets he is his money. But it is his silver, I think makes more sense given the connection with verse 19, that the guilty party must pay the injured person for any loss of time. If someone's working as an indentured servant to pay off a debt to someone they owe it to, and that someone injures them so they can't work, bro, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Like, why would you injure the one who's paying back? No, you don't have to pay because you'd be paying yourself for the loss of labor. But you can't charge it to his account, it is the idea. Like, you're going to eat the loss, and you should know better than to injure someone who's working for you. That's counterproductive. So I think the answer to the question, is it okay to beat your slave as long as they don't die? It's really dumb to beat your employee because they're working for you. Why would you do that? I think that's the bottom line.
Okay, that makes sense. So when we look at this, it's partly thinking, I got to motivate my slave. I got to keep him in line. We're thinking of maybe the Israelites when they were enslaved in Egypt and many times just beaten and controlled harshly.
Yep.
Sounds like you would argue when you consider the rest of how servants were supposed to be treated, that they're made in the image of God.
Yep.
Casuistic law is not saying, oh, this isn't even talking about the way, I can motivate servants to work harder in the land. That's not the context. The flip around after affirming that servants are made in the image of God and the punishment would be equal, saying that the slave is his money is saying that the slave or servant works for you. And so why would you beat one near its, where he or she could possibly die?
Right.
This is like this is a bad example. I was going to say like taking equipment that works for me and damaging it, so I have to go back and fix it. Of course, servants are not
They're
equipment,
people,
but the idea of being like it's stupid and counterproductive is more the context of what this is talking about.
And I think if we hop down to verse 26, we can see another scenario under this umbrella. An owner who hits a male or female indentured servant in the eye and destroys it must let them go free to compensate for the eye. So this is related to this question of beating. If you're beating someone who's working for you so that they sustain a permanent injury, they get to go free, which means their debts are canceled. Whatever they were working to pay off is done now, and you just lost that. You lost your privilege because their body does not belong to you. Their labor might belong to you temporarily to pay off a debt, but they are not your property.
That's a great distinction between their body and between their labor.
Yeah.
And so amidst some of the jarring words here and differences in culture, it sounds like you would argue that there's actually some dignity that's preserved and value that's preserved and rights preserved for the servants.
Yeah.
Even though it's not going to perfectly match on to the kind of rights there are today, because God has taken a people group and moving them in a positive direction. But it's certainly not saying, hey, if you got a slave, you can beat him whenever you want to. Just don't kill him. It's clearly not the point of this passage.
Yeah, clearly not the point.
Well done. Good stuff. So I'm going to ask you a tough question about your faith. How do you respond? If you're going to make the case for Christianity, you need more than good vibes. You need evidence and a way to find that evidence and communicate it well. Logos is the library that I use every day when I'm personally studying the Bible, when I'm preparing talks, lectures, getting ready for YouTube interviews. It's got original languages and tools you can use in one place and search in seconds. Start a 60-day free trial at logos.com/McDowell. Link is in the description.